The high desert has a way of keeping secrets. Under the vast Arizona sky, where the air shimmers with heat and the landscape stretches endlessly toward distant mountains, things disappear. Dreams, hope, people. On September 18th, 1999, a Saturday night that should have ended with celebration and cold beer, a young man drove away from Prescott Valley Speedway and vanished into the darkness. His name was Dylan Carson. He was 24 years old. He had a mother who loved him, a girlfriend who adored him, and a dream that burned so bright, everyone who knew him could feel its heat. What happened to Dylan Carson in the hours after that race should have been simple to solve. This was America at the end of the millennium, not the Old West, not some lawless frontier where people could simply disappear without consequence. But Dylan did disappear, and for 25 years, the only witnesses to his final moments were the desert wind, the stars overhead, and a man who called himself Dylan's friend. This is the story of ambition and betrayal, of a mother who refused to stop searching, of a cold case that seemed impossible to solve until technology caught up with the truth. This is the story of the last race. Let me take you back to September 1999. Y2K panic was building toward its anticlimactic conclusion. People were stockpiling water and canned goods, convinced that computers would fail and civilization would collapse when the calendar rolled over to 2000. The internet was still accessed through screeching dial-up modems. Cell phones were expensive luxuries, not the lifelines we carry today. And if you wanted to find someone, you didn't track their location on an app. You called their house and hoped they were home. This was the world Dylan Carson inhabited, a world where you could still disappear. But on September 18th, disappearing was the furthest thing from Dylan's mind. He was, by all accounts, on the verge of something special. The Prescott Valley Speedway was his cathedral, a quarter-mile oval of asphalt, an ambition where amateur drivers came to prove themselves under sodium lights that turned the kicked-up dust into golden fog. Dylan had been racing there since he was 16, 8 years of double shifts at his uncle's auto body shop, 8 years of sleeping in the bed of his pickup truck between races, 8 years of grinding toward a dream that seemed impossible to everyone except him. NASCAR. Not the small-time circuit where he currently competed. Not the local speedway where maybe 200 people showed up on a good night. Dylan Carson wanted Daytona. He wanted Talladega. He wanted to hear his name announced to crowds of thousands, to see his number on television screens, to make his mother cry tears of pride in Victory Lane. And here's the thing, it wasn't a fantasy. Dylan had the talent. He had the work ethic. And by September of 1999, he finally had something else, a serious sponsor. Frank Castellano owned a transmission shop in town, and he'd been watching Dylan race for 2 years. He saw the same thing everyone else saw: raw talent, relentless determination, and a hunger that couldn't be faked. In August, Castellano had handed Dylan a check for $15,000. An advance, he called it, an investment in Dylan's 2000 racing season. For a 24-year-old auto body worker, $15,000 might as well have been $1 million. It was validation. It was proof that the dream wasn't crazy, that the sacrifices hadn't been in vain. Dylan had deposited that check on August 23rd. By September 15th, just 3 days before he disappeared, he'd withdrawn $10,000 of it in cash. Remember that detail. We'll come back to it. The race on September 18th was nothing special. Dylan finished 4th in his heat. Respectable, solid, the kind of performance that kept sponsors interested without setting the world on fire. Friends who saw him afterward remembered him laughing, joking about nearly spinning out in turn 3, talking about how his rebuilt carburetor had performed better than expected. He wore his lucky jacket that night, black leather with his number 37 stitched in white on the back. His sandy blonde hair was still damp from washing off the sweat and grime in the Speedway's cramped locker room. By 10 o'clock, he'd loaded his gear into his midnight blue Ford F-150. The truck was his pride and joy, a 1996 model he'd bought, used, and kept immaculate despite the desert's constant assault of red dust. Racing stickers covered the rear window. There was a small dent in the driver's side door where he'd backed into a post 2 months earlier. But other than that, the truck looked like it had just rolled off the lot. At 9:45, Dylan made a call from the payphone bank near the Speedway concession stand. His girlfriend, Rebecca Mitchell, was working the night shift at Prescott Regional Hospital. She was a nurse, 23 years old, and by all accounts, completely in love with Dylan. They'd been together for 2 years. "Be safe," she told him on that call, her voice crackling through the phone line. "Call me tomorrow." "I will," Dylan said. His voice was relaxed, happy even. He mentioned celebrating because Frank Castellano had hinted at even more funding for the next season. Everything was falling into place, Rebecca would later tell investigators. Everything was finally coming together for him. Dylan told her he was heading to Murphy's Tavern, a dive bar on Gurley Street, where racers congregated after events to drink cheap beer and talk about their near victories. The drive should have taken 25 minutes along Highway 69, a route Dylan knew by heart. He'd driven it hundreds of times. Rebecca hung up the phone, returned to her rounds at the hospital, and didn't think anything of it. Why would she? Dylan was just going to meet his friends. He'd be home later, or maybe he'd crash at his apartment if he had one too many beers. They'd talk tomorrow. They'd make plans. Life would continue in the way it does when you're young and in love and convinced that the future is a gift that's already been wrapped and delivered. Except Dylan Carson never arrived at Murphy's Tavern that night. His friends waited until midnight before assuming he'd gone home tired. It wasn't unusual for someone to skip the post-race drinks. They thought nothing of it. By Sunday afternoon, when Dylan didn't show up for a family barbecue at his mother's house, Carol Carson knew with the certainty that only a mother can possess that something was catastrophically wrong. Her son never missed family gatherings. He never failed to call if he was going to be late. He was reliable, responsible. He was the kind of son who still stopped by twice a week to help his widowed mother with yard work and repairs. At 4:17 a.m. on Sunday afternoon, Carol Carson called the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office, her voice shaking, and reported her son missing. The search for Dylan Carson had begun. But the truth, the terrible truth about what had happened to him, wouldn't emerge for another 25 years. Before we continue, I want to ask you something. If you're finding this story as gripping as I do, please take a second to hit that subscribe button. True crime stories like Dylan's deserve to be heard, and your support helps us bring more of these forgotten cases back into the light. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Are you in Arizona, familiar with these desert roads Dylan drove? Or are you halfway around the world, listening to this story unfold? I love hearing from you, and I read every single comment. All right, let's get back to 1999, where a mother's worst nightmare was just beginning. Detective Jennifer Hayes got the case on Monday morning. She was in her mid-30s, sharp-eyed, methodical, the kind of investigator who kept leather-bound notebooks filled with meticulous observations. She'd transferred to Yavapai County from Phoenix PD 2 years earlier, seeking a quieter life. This case would be anything but quiet. The last confirmed sighting of Dylan Carson was at 10:05 p.m. on Saturday, September 18th. An elderly parking lot attendant named Walter Chen had waved goodbye as Dylan's blue F-150 pulled out onto the access road. Chen remembered because Dylan always tipped him $5, a kindness that stuck in the old man's memory. After that, nothing. No witnesses along Highway 69, no stops at gas stations, no signs of the truck anywhere between the Speedway and Prescott. It was as if Dylan had driven into a void. Detective Hayes organized search parties that combed the highway shoulders and nearby ravines, looking for evidence of an accident, skid marks, broken glass, anything that might explain a sudden disappearance. The terrain was unforgiving. Scrub brush, ponderosa pines, limestone outcroppings that could hide a vehicle if it had gone off-road in the darkness. Volunteers from the racing community joined the searches. Dozens of men and women who knew Dylan, who'd shared beers and stories with him, who couldn't believe he was simply gone. They walked grid patterns through the high desert, calling his name into the wind. They found nothing but beer cans and ancient car parts and the scattered evidence of other people's discarded lives. Rebecca Mitchell took time off work to help search. Her nurse's scrubs traded for hiking boots and a faded denim jacket. Her eyes were red from crying and lack of sleep. She kept touching her phone, an old pager. Actually, the technology of the time kept checking for messages that never came. The sheriff's department issued a BOLO alert for Dylan's vehicle. Tips trickled in slowly. Someone thought they'd seen a similar truck near Sedona on Sunday morning. Another caller reported a blue pickup at a rest stop near Camp Verde. Each lead was followed. Each one dissolved into nothing. The truck that haunted everyone's thoughts remained invisible, as if it had driven off the edge of the world. Then, on Thursday morning, September 23rd, 5 days after Dylan disappeared, everything changed. A rancher named Henry Bradford was riding his property line on horseback, checking fence posts along a stretch of dirt road that cut through his land about 30 miles north of Prescott. That's when he spotted something that didn't belong. A blue pickup truck sat motionless in a shallow ravine, just off the road, partially hidden by juniper trees and tall grass that had grown up around the wheels. Bradford approached cautiously. The truck was empty. The driver's door was closed but unlocked. There was no visible damage to the exterior. He wrote down the license plate number on a scrap of paper he kept in his shirt pocket and rode back to his ranch house to make the call. Detective Hayes arrived on scene within 40 minutes, her unmarked sedan kicking up plumes of red dust. Crime scene technicians followed in a white van, bringing cameras and evidence collection kits and that heavy sense of dread that accompanies every potential breakthrough in a missing persons case. Dylan's midnight blue F-150 looked almost peaceful in the morning light, as if it had simply decided to rest there among the junipers and wait for someone to find it. Hayes approached the vehicle wearing latex gloves. The driver's side door opened with a soft creak that seemed obscenely loud in the desert silence. Inside, the truck smelled stale like old vinyl and dust and something vaguely chemical she couldn't quite identify. The keys were not in the ignition. That detail struck her immediately. Someone had taken them. This wasn't a simple case of Dylan pulling over and wandering off in confusion. The interior was remarkably tidy. No fast food wrappers or empty soda cans cluttering the floor. In the center console, Hayes found Dylan's brown leather wallet containing his driver's license, $63 in cash, 2 credit cards, and a photograph of Rebecca Mitchell smiling at the camera. On the dashboard, a pair of Ray-Ban sunglasses sat folded neatly, but it was the item on the passenger seat that made Hayes's breath catch in her throat. A worn road atlas, the kind you bought at gas stations before GPS, lay open to a page showing northern Arizona. Someone had circled a location in red ink, approximately 60 miles northwest of where they currently stood. Deep in the Kaibab National Forest, near the Utah border. The circle encompassed an area of wilderness with no towns, no major roads, nothing but Forest Service trails and elevation lines, indicating rough, mountainous terrain. There were no notes, no written explanation, just that single red circle, pulsing with meaning on the faded paper. Detective Hayes photographed it from multiple angles while the crime scene techs began processing the rest of the vehicle. The forensic examination took hours. They found no blood, no weapons, no obvious signs of violence. The truck's engine was cold, had been cold for days. Tire tracks in the soft earth suggested the vehicle had been driven to this location deliberately, not pushed or towed. Whoever had parked it here had known exactly where they were going. As the sun climbed higher and the temperature pushed past 90 degrees, Hayes stood beside the F-150 and stared at that circled location on the map, wondering if it was a destination Dylan had been heading toward, or a place someone wanted investigators to find. The forensic unit found one more thing during their search, something wedged under the passenger seat that would seem insignificant for 19 years. A beer bottle, Coors Light. The label was faded, but the bottle was otherwise intact. They photographed it, documented its position, dusted it for fingerprints. The prints were too smudged to identify with the technology available in 1999. They bagged the bottle anyway, logged it into evidence, and moved on to other leads. That beer bottle would eventually solve the case, but not for another 2 decades. Detective Hayes organized a massive search of the area marked on the atlas. She coordinated with Forest Service rangers who knew the Kaibab terrain, bringing in volunteers and search dogs, and a helicopter that flew grid patterns over ponderosa pine forests and steep canyon walls. They searched for 3 weeks. They found nothing. No abandoned campsites, no disturbed earth that might indicate a grave, no evidence that Dylan Carson, or anyone else, had recently been in that remote section of wilderness. The circle remained an enigma, a clue that pointed nowhere. Meanwhile, the investigation splintered into competing theories. Carol Carson mentioned strange phone calls Dylan had received in the weeks before his disappearance. Calls where nobody spoke when he answered, just silence and breathing, then a click as the line went dead. This had happened 3 or 4 times, always late at night, always from numbers that showed up as unavailable on his caller ID box. Rebecca Mitchell had her own suspicions. She knew the amateur racing circuit wasn't always clean. Money changed hands in parking lots and grandstands. Some people bet serious cash on outcomes that were supposed to be purely competitive sport. She mentioned a man named Anthony Martelli, a regular at the Speedway, who ran an informal betting operation. Dylan had witnessed arguments after races, had seen Martelli and his associates confronting drivers they suspected of throwing races or failing to perform as expected. Could Dylan have seen something he shouldn't have? Could he have become a liability? The theory had weight until Detective Hayes interviewed Martelli. He had an alibi for the night in question. His betting operation was small-time nickels and dimes, he insisted. Nobody killed anyone over a few $100s in amateur stock car wagers. The sheriff's department pursued another angle: drug trafficking. Iron Springs Road, where the truck had been found, ran through territory that had become a known corridor for moving drugs between the Mexican border and distribution points in Utah and Nevada. Could Dylan have gotten involved in something over his head? Maybe thinking it was a one-time thing to fund his racing dreams, only to discover you couldn't simply walk away? But that theory collapsed when it ran into the brick wall of Dylan Carson's actual life. His bank records showed no unusual deposits. His friends and family were unanimous. Dylan rarely drank alcohol, was almost obsessive about keeping his body and mind in peak condition for racing. The idea of him as a drug courier felt like a narrative imposed from outside, a story that fit statistics, but didn't fit the actual human being who'd vanished. By the winter of 2000, the investigation had entered that terrible purgatory where cold cases go to die. Detective Hayes still worked the case, but she had other crimes demanding her attention. Other victims who were still alive and needed justice. The Dylan Carson file grew thicker with reports and witness statements and forensic analyses that revealed nothing conclusive. The truck had been processed exhaustively. Dylan's fingerprints were everywhere, as expected. Rebecca's prints were on the passenger side door handle and dashboard, consistent with her riding in the vehicle. A few unidentified partial prints appeared on the steering wheel, and gear shift too incomplete to run through databases. No blood. No signs of violence. The beer bottle found under the passenger seat? The fingerprints were too smudged to identify, and the DNA testing technology available in early 2000 required samples that were larger and better preserved than what they'd recovered from the bottle's mouth. The lab technician apologized in her written report, explaining that DNA analysis was still evolving. Perhaps in the future, when techniques improved, they might be able to extract usable genetic material. But for now, the bottle represented another dead end. It went into an evidence box, along with the road atlas and Dylan's wallet and sunglasses items that told a story no one could quite read. Carol Carson refused to accept the silence. She took unpaid leave from her job and devoted herself entirely to finding her son. She printed flyers at her own expense, hundreds of them, featuring Dylan's photograph and physical description, posting them in gas stations and grocery stores and laundromats across 3 counties. She organized search parties on weekends, leading groups of volunteers into the desert. The other searchers were kind to her, patient with her desperate hope. But everyone could see that they were looking for a body now, rather than a living person. 15 months had passed. The Arizona sun and predators in simple decay would have left little to find, even if they searched in exactly the right location. And the wilderness was vast beyond imagining. Rebecca Mitchell tried to move forward with her life the way young people must when grief threatens to consume them entirely. She continued working at the hospital, pulling double shifts that left her too exhausted to dream. She dated occasionally but never seriously, because every man she met was measured against Dylan's memory and found wanting. On the anniversary of his disappearance, September 18th, 2001, Rebecca drove to the location where his truck had been found and left flowers tied to a juniper tree, knowing the desert would claim them within days, but needing to mark the spot somehow. Detective Hayes officially archived the case in March of 2002, though she never used the word closed when speaking with Carol Carson. The case remained open to new leads, she explained gently. The distinction was semantic. Meaningless to a mother who called the sheriff's office every 2 weeks asking if there were any updates, if anyone still cared that her son had been erased from the world without explanation. The honest answer was that people did care. But they had nowhere left to look. Nothing left to investigate. The case file was boxed and moved to long-term storage, labeled with Dylan's name and case number, filed alphabetically between dozens of other unsolved disappearances and murders that haunted Yavapai County's history. The box sat in darkness and waited. It would wait for 16 more years. I need to pause here for a moment because this story gets even more intense, and I want to make sure you're still with me. If you're emotionally invested in finding out what happened to Dylan, if you're feeling that same frustration his mother felt, that same desperate need for answers, do me a favor and leave a comment right now. Just tell me, what do you think happened? Do you have a theory? And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. Cases like this need to be remembered. Dylan Carson deserves to have his story told, and your subscription helps make that possible. All right, let's jump forward to 2018. where technology finally catches up with the truth. March 2018. 19 years after Dylan Carson disappeared, Detective Rachel Turner had joined the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit in 2015. She'd inherited a backlog of unsolved investigations that stretched back decades, files boxed in storage rooms where the air smelled like old paper and institutional neglect. She'd been systematically reviewing cases, looking for ones that might benefit from advances in forensic technology that had transformed criminal investigation since the turn of the millennium. DNA analysis had evolved dramatically. In 1999, you needed blood-soaked evidence to extract a usable genetic profile. By 2018, criminalists could pull DNA from skin cells left on a steering wheel, from saliva residue on a cigarette butt, from the microscopic traces of human contact that we leave on everything we touch. They called it touch DNA, and it was about to crack the Dylan Carson case wide open. Turner pulled the file in January 2018, reading through Detective Hayes's meticulous reports with growing interest. The case grabbed hold of her imagination, the way certain mysteries do the abandoned truck, with its cryptic map, the complete absence of witnesses, the life interrupted mid-trajectory with no explanation. She contacted the evidence storage facility and requested that all physical evidence be transported to the county's forensic laboratory, which had been upgraded significantly since 2000. The beer bottle arrived in a sealed evidence bag, logged and cataloged with the same case number it had carried for 18 years. Turner held it up to the light in the lab's sterile examination room. Coors Light, common enough to be meaningless as a clue. Dylan's friends and family had insisted he typically drank only occasionally and preferred local craft beers when he did. The presence of a mass-market light beer was somewhat inconsistent with his habits. But inconsistencies weren't evidence. Not in 1999. Dr. David Ramirez, the forensic scientist assigned to reanalyze the evidence, explained that modern DNA extraction techniques could work with samples that previous methods would have dismissed as insufficient. He worked for 6 weeks on that bottle, using chemical baths and amplification processes and analysis equipment that cost more than Turner's annual salary. The results came back on a Friday afternoon in late April. Dr. Ramirez handed Turner a manila folder with an expression somewhere between excitement and disbelief. They had a profile, a complete male DNA profile extracted from saliva residue on the bottle's mouth, preserved by some miracle of chemistry and luck and the dry Arizona climate. The profile didn't match Dylan Carson, whose DNA had been entered into databases years earlier from biological samples his mother had provided. It didn't match any of the known associates whose DNA had been collected during the original investigation. The profile belonged to someone who'd drunk from that bottle and whose identity remained unknown. Someone who'd been in Dylan's truck at some point before or during his disappearance. Turner ran the profile through CODIS, the combined DNA index system that connected forensic laboratories across the country. The database contained millions of genetic profiles from convicted offenders and crime scenes. She expected nothing. Expected the same wall of silence that had met every previous avenue of investigation. Instead, the computer returned a match within 48 hours. The DNA belonged to a man with a prior criminal record. Someone whose genetic profile had been entered into the database following a 2003 arrest for assault in Flagstaff. Turner stared at the name on her screen, feeling that peculiar vertigo that accompanies breakthrough moments in cold cases, the sensation that reality has suddenly shifted beneath your feet. The name was Marcus Fletcher, 52 years old. The same Marcus Fletcher who'd been interviewed early in the original investigation, who'd claimed to be Dylan's friend, who'd expressed shock and grief at the disappearance, who'd provided an alibi that had never been seriously questioned. But here's what made Turner's blood run cold. The original case file noted that Fletcher had denied being in Dillon's truck in the days before the disappearance, had said specifically that he hadn't seen Dillon outside of the racetrack for over a week before September 18th. The DNA said otherwise. Marcus Fletcher had drunk from that beer bottle, had been in that truck, had lied to investigators 19 years earlier. And if he'd lied about that, what else had he lied about? Turner spent the next 6 months building an airtight case. She tracked down bank records from 1999 and 2000, subpoenaing documents from institutions that had merged or changed names multiple times. What she found was damning. In November 1999, 2 months after Dillon disappeared, Fletcher had deposited $8,000 in cash into his checking account. He'd claimed the money came from selling a boat. Turner verified that no boat sale had occurred. Fletcher had never owned a boat. In March 2000, another cash deposit, $12,000, attributed to inheritance from a deceased uncle. But the uncle had died in 1998, and his will distributed assets to other family members with no mention of Marcus Fletcher. The money had come from somewhere, and the lies surrounding its origin suggested consciousness of guilt. But Turner discovered something even more significant, a connection the original investigation had completely missed. Frank Castellano, Dillon's racing sponsor, had maintained detailed financial records. In August 1999, he'd given Dillon a check for $15,000 in advance on the increased sponsorship. Dillon deposited that check on August 23rd. On September 15th, 3 days before he disappeared, Dillon withdrew $10,000 in cash. The withdrawal slip noted that the money was for racing equipment purchases. But when Turner tracked down Dillon's suppliers, none of them had records of large cash purchases from him in September 1999. The $10,000 had gone somewhere. Turner believed she knew exactly where Dillon had loaned the money to Marcus Fletcher, probably as a gesture of friendship, towards someone he'd known for years, someone he trusted. Despite warning signs he should have recognized. Because Turner had dug deeper into Fletcher's background and found something truly ugly. In 1998 and 1999, Marcus Fletcher had been drowning in gambling debt. $45,000 owed to men in Phoenix, men who'd filed a civil lawsuit against him in August 1999 demanding repayment. Men who were, to put it mildly, not the forgiving type. Turner flew to Las Vegas to interview one of them, a man named Vincent Romano, now 68, and retired from what he vaguely described as various business ventures. Romano was careful not to explicitly admit anything criminal, but he confirmed the debt, confirmed that Fletcher had been desperate in September 1999, confirmed that there had been consequences for continued default. And here's the kicker. Romano remembered Fletcher mentioning a friend who raced, a kid with potential, a kid who'd attracted a sponsor with actual money. Romano had gotten the impression that Fletcher resented this friend's success. In September or October of 1999, Fletcher had claimed he'd soon have the money to pay off the debt, that something was coming through that would solve his financial problems. In October 2013, months after Dillon disappeared, Fletcher paid off the entire debt with a cashier's check. Turner flew back to Arizona with a theory that felt both inevitable and horrifying. Marcus Fletcher had been desperate for money, threatened by dangerous men. Watching his friend Dillon Carson receive increased sponsorship and attention, at some point, Fletcher had decided to solve his problems through violence. The beer bottle proved they'd been together, despite Fletcher's denials. The truck's location on that remote ranch road suggested knowledge of the area, the kind of knowledge a local mechanic who'd lived in Prescott his entire life would possess. The sudden debt payment a year later suggested access to money that had come from somewhere. Turner conducted surveillance on Fletcher for 3 days before approaching him. He lived in a modest ranch house on the eastern edge of Prescott, worked at the same auto repair shop where he'd been employed in 1999, drove a newer model Chevrolet pickup, kept his yard maintained but unremarkable. To all external appearances, Marcus Fletcher was exactly what he seemed to be: a middle-aged mechanic, living a quiet life in a small Arizona city, someone whose face you'd forget 5 minutes after passing him on the street. But Turner had learned in 20 years of police work that the most dangerous people often look the most ordinary, that monsters rarely announce themselves. On October 15th, 2024, 25 years and 27 days after Dylan Carson disappeared, Detective Rachel Turner arrested Marcus Fletcher. The interrogation took place in a small room at the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office that smelled like industrial cleaner and stale air conditioning. Turner laid out the evidence methodically: the DNA on the beer bottle, the financial records, the timeline that placed him with Dylan on the night of September 18, 1999. She watched his face as she spoke, watched the defenses crumble in real time, watched something that might have been relief flicker in his eyes. Marcus Fletcher confessed. Over the course of 4 hours, his voice flat and emotionless, he described events that had haunted him for a quarter century. Dylan had loaned him $10,000 in September, he admitted, money that Fletcher had promised to repay within 6 months. But the money hadn't been enough to satisfy Vincent Romano and his associates, had barely made a dent in what Fletcher owed. On September 18th, Fletcher had gone to the Speedway specifically to talk to Dylan, to ask for more money, to beg for help from someone who seemed to have everything Fletcher lacked. They'd argued in the parking lot after the races, an argument that escalated when Dylan said he couldn't loan any more money. That $10,000 was already more than he could afford to give. Fletcher had followed Dylan when he left the Speedway, flashed his lights to get Dylan to pull over on Iron Springs Road. They'd driven to that remote location together, Dylan following in his truck, Fletcher leading in his own vehicle. They'd argued again, standing in the darkness with nothing around them but desert and stars. Dylan had said he wanted his money back, said he needed it for his racing career, threatened to tell Frank Castellano about Fletcher's gambling debts and connections to dangerous people. Something broke inside Fletcher in that moment, some combination of rage and desperation and jealousy that had been building for months. He'd hit Dylan with a tire iron from his truck, hit him multiple times, until Dylan stopped moving. Stopped breathing, stopped being the obstacle between Fletcher and survival. Turner listened without interrupting, letting the confession flow, noting details that only the killer could know. Fletcher described dragging Dylan's body into his own truck, driving deeper into the wilderness, while Dylan's F-150 sat abandoned on the ranch road. He'd buried Dylan in a location he'd scouted weeks earlier while four-wheeling in the national forest, a location remote enough that he believed it would never be found. Then he'd returned to Dylan's truck, wiped down surfaces, and planted that road atlas open to a random page with a random circle drawn in red ink to mislead investigators. The misdirection had worked better than he'd hoped, had sent search parties 60 miles from where Dylan actually lay buried. But Fletcher hadn't acted entirely alone. His younger brother Ryan, now 38, had helped move the body that night, had kept the secret for 25 years because blood loyalty ran deeper than law or morality. And Eric Sullivan, a longtime friend of the Fletcher family, had provided Marcus with a false alibi when investigators came asking questions in 1999. had sworn under oath that Marcus had been at his house playing poker the entire evening of September 18th. The lies had held for a quarter century. They crumbled in less than a day once Turner confronted Ryan and Sullivan with the evidence of Marcus's confession. Act 4. Coming Home. 40-0, 48-0. Carol Carson was 73 years old when Detective Turner called her on October 17, 2024. Turner had rehearsed the conversation multiple times, knowing that no words could adequately prepare a mother to hear that someone had been arrested for her son's murder after 25 years of silence. That the man who'd murdered her son had been someone Dylan trusted. Someone who'd attended his funeral and expressed condolences while knowing exactly where the body was buried. Carol's voice went quiet for a long moment after Turner finished explaining. Quiet enough that Turner worried the news had been too much. Then Carol spoke, her voice steady despite the tears Turner could hear behind the words. She asked where Dylan was buried, asked if they'd found him yet, asked if she could finally bring her son home. The recovery operation took place over 3 days in late October, coordinated between the sheriff's office, the county medical examiner, and forensic anthropologists from Northern Arizona University. Marcus Fletcher had provided precise directions to the burial site, located in a canyon approximately 40 miles northwest of Prescott, in terrain so remote that the recovery team had to hike 2 miles from the nearest Forest Service road, carrying equipment and body bags. The site was marked by nothing except a subtle depression in the ground and a small cairn of rocks that had shifted over the decades but remained roughly where Fletcher had stacked them in September 1999. Turner stood with the recovery team as they carefully excavated the grave, watching as brushes and trowels revealed bones that had weathered a quarter century of exposure to elements and wildlife. The skeleton was incomplete, scattered by animals and decomposition, but enough remained for positive identification through dental records. They found other items buried with him, personal effects that Fletcher had failed to remove in his panic. A watch that had stopped at 10:47, presumably the approximate time of Dylan's death. Remnants of the leather racing jacket with the number 37 still faintly visible on degraded material. A belt buckle shaped like a checkered flag. A gift from Rebecca Mitchell on his 23rd birthday. The objects were bagged and cataloged as evidence, but Turner knew they also represented something more. They were the physical remnants of a life interrupted. Tangible proof that Dylan Carson had existed and dreamed and loved before violence erased his future. The recovery team worked with reverence, treating the remains with the dignity they deserved, knowing that a mother waited, 73 years old, and desperate to finally lay her child to rest. The legal proceedings moved forward with the inexorable weight of overwhelming evidence. Marcus Fletcher was charged with first-degree murder, facing life imprisonment without possibility of parole. His attorney advised him to plead guilty in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. Fletcher accepted the deal in December 2024. Standing before Judge Thomas Martinez in a Prescott courtroom, he formally admitted to the murder of Dylan Carson 25 years after the crime. Carol Carson sat in the gallery, flanked by Rebecca Mitchell and members of the racing community who'd never forgotten the young man with dreams of NASCAR glory. She read a victim impact statement that left the courtroom silent, describing 25 years of wondering and hoping and grieving. 25 years of birthday cakes never eaten, and Christmas presents never opened, and grandchildren who would never exist. I'm 73 years old, Carol said, her voice breaking. I've spent more than a third of my life not knowing what happened to my son, not knowing if he was alive or dead. Not knowing if he was cold or scared or calling for me in his final moments. She looked directly at Marcus Fletcher as she spoke. You took my son from me. You took his future. You took every moment we should have had together. every holiday, every milestone, every ordinary Tuesday evening, when I could have heard his voice on the phone. Her hands trembled as she held a photograph of Dylan at age 24. But you didn't just take Dylan's life, you took mine too. Because I've been living in hell for 25 years. And you let me suffer there while you went on with your life like nothing happened. Ryan Fletcher pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact and obstruction of justice. He received 7 years in state prison, a penalty that seemed inadequate to those who believed one phone call to investigators in 1999 could have prevented 25 years of anguish. Eric Sullivan was charged with perjury for providing false alibi testimony. He received 3 years in prison, his reputation destroyed, his wife filed for divorce. The lumberyard where he'd worked for 30 years terminated his employment immediately. The consequences rippled outward from his choices like waves from a stone dropped in still water. On a Saturday afternoon in November, the racing community in Prescott organized a memorial service for Dylan Carson at the same speedway where he'd raced his last race 25 years earlier. Over 200 people attended, some who'd known Dylan personally, others who'd only heard stories about the talented young driver who disappeared before reaching his potential. They dedicated a plaque in his honor. Mounted on the pit area wall, where he'd prepared his car for countless races. Carol Carson stood beside the plaque with Rebecca Mitchell, both women crying as a moment of silence was observed. Then engines revved in tribute, a sound that echoed across the high desert like thunder. Dylan's remains were cremated at his mother's request and scattered at Sedona's Red Rocks, the location where he and Rebecca had taken that photograph years earlier. When the future seemed limitless, and death was something that happened to other people in distant places, the wind carried his ashes across the desert landscape he'd loved, finally bringing him home after a quarter-century of absence. Closing, 48-0. 50-0. Carol Carson died peacefully 18 months later. In the spring of 2026, she'd lived long enough to know what happened to her son, to know that justice had finally been served, even if it came 2.5 decades too late. To know that Dylan hadn't run away or abandoned her or chosen to disappear, that he'd been murdered by someone who called himself a friend. She was buried, holding a photograph of Dylan at age 24, forever young in her memory. Forever the boy with dreams of racing glory who'd trusted the wrong person on a September night in 1999. Rebecca Mitchell attended the funeral. She's 50 now, married to someone else, with children of her own. But she told me she still thinks about Dylan, still wonders what kind of man he would have become, what kind of life they might have built together. The worst part, she said, is that it was so preventable. If Marcus had just been honest, if he'd just asked for help the right way instead of what he did, Dylan would have helped him. That's who Dylan was. He would have found a way. That's the tragedy at the heart of this story. Dylan Carson died not because he refused to help a friend, but because he tried to help and it wasn't enough. He died because Marcus Fletcher's desperation turned to rage. Because 25 years ago, on a dark desert road, one man's dreams were murdered by another man's jealousy and greed. The Prescott Valley Speedway still operates today. The plaque commemorating Dylan Carson is still there, on the pit area wall, bearing his number 37 and a simple inscription, Dylan Carson, 1975 to 1999, forever racing. If you drive along Iron Springs Road at night, when the desert is quiet and the stars are out, you might think about Dylan, about the life he should have lived, about the mother who never stopped searching, about the beer bottle that sat in an evidence room for 19 years, waiting for technology to catch up with the truth. The high desert still keeps secrets. But sometimes, those secrets finally come to light. Thank you for listening to The Last Race. If this story moved you the way it moved me, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Share this video with someone who loves true crime. And leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I genuinely love hearing from you and knowing that Dylan's story is reaching people around the world. Justice delayed is not justice denied. 25 years later, Dylan Carson finally got his justice. And his mother finally got to bring him home. I'll see you in the next one. Stay curious, stay safe, and remember, the truth always finds a way.